Yeah.
for June.
Okay.
I know June didn't want to leave because she didn't want to church.
Continuing on in Revelation, we're in chapter 12. We're fixing to come to, with chapter 13, basically what divides the Revelation letter, and we'll see some of the figures and symbols and other things in chapter 13 that will show a definite change. But what we've seen so far in chapter 12 is pretty exciting. We've seen the woman who represents God's people, represents God's plan, represents everything that God has in store for man's redemption. The promise that was given to Abraham, the pronouncement of victory for Christ from Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, of Jesus over Satan, all of those things coming forward to the birth of Christ, the formation of the church, and the work of the church, and the persecution of the church that we'll see Satan try to. We've seen the woman giving birth and having the pains of birth, and we know that the church came into existence with great pain, because what brought the church into existence was Christ on that cross. And as Peter opens his sermon in Acts chapter 2, we're reminded that everything centers around Christ on that cross. That's the big turning point from all humanity. It's interesting that our calendar begins with the person of Christ as we know it now. So Jesus is in everything that has to do with man and his salvation. And we found that as we open that scene up, that who's waiting to bring about persecution, who's bringing about to try to stop God's plan? Well, it's the old dragon, Satan. And he's pictured as waiting for the woman to give birth, and he's going to devour the child. In other words, he's going to try to stop God's plan. But we know that Jesus is always victorious in everything that he was destined to do. God's plan revolves around victory. You know, we have that song, Victory in Jesus. Well, that sums up God's plan. Jesus was victorious in the cross because he didn't stay in that tomb. So he was victorious over all of the efforts to stop him from going to the cross. Then once he was put on that cross, everything was done to make sure he didn't come out of that tomb. He was victorious over that. So everything that Satan has tried to throw in his path, Jesus has overcome. So as we look at Revelation chapter 12, we're going to look at beginning in verse 14 this morning. Well, let's pick up in 13, and this kind of begins the paragraph here. And when the dragon saw that he was cast under the earth, he persecuted the woman who brought forth the man-child. In other words, as soon as Satan figured out, well, I can't stop Jesus from being born, I can't stop him from going to the cross, so I'm going to persecute the church. I'm going to do everything I can to immobilize God's people. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent. God is protecting the church. He's looking after the church. He's preserving his plan. Because, you know, there are so many different teachers today that teach that when Jesus came to be a king, to set up his kingdom, that he failed. And that he kind of left the church as a temporary holdover, as something to kind of bide the time until he comes back again to establish his kingdom. Well, we understand that Jesus did fulfill his mission of establishing the kingdom. Paul speaks of being in the kingdom. John opens the Revelation letter in chapter 1, speaking that he was in the kingdom. So Jesus was victorious in everything he set out to do. And no matter what the serpent has tried to do, he has not been able to stop Jesus, and he's not been able to stop the church. We're here today. And there have been numerous times that the church has been so bitterly persecuted, and we're going to talk about that more in chapter 13 as we get into the detail of the Roman Empire and the symbols of the beasts and their persecution of God's people. But we understand that the church did not just run away and hide. It's been actually taken to a place of protection where it can flourish, where it can grow, where it can not just maintain strength, but gain strength. And we see, as we'll get into chapter 13, that all the persecution that was brought upon the church did what? It scattered it to where it grew and grew and grew in strength and in number. So we see that God has not left us defenseless. He's not left us unprotected. But it's up to us to carry on the strength and the work that maintains the strength and the work in the church. So God has furnished us everything we need. As Peter says, we are thoroughly furnished unto every good work. So God has built us up and kept us safe. And this idea of the church being born on eagle's wings, as a reference to that phrase, turn with me to the book of Exodus for just a moment. When we think about God taking care of His people, there's no better example than the book of Exodus, as God heard the cry of the Israelites in bondage. He responded by sending Moses, and He carried them, so to speak, figuratively. God carried them out of Egypt. In Exodus chapter 3, in verse 4, and the Lord saw that he turned aside to see. God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Draw nigh hither, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them out of that land unto a good land, and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come unto me, and I have also seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppress them. God is already got a plan in place to get them out. This tells us something else about this situation. God heard the cry of the Egyptians as they prayed for deliverance. This tells us that God is a listening God. He's a caring God, but not only is He caring and He's listening, He is able to carry out His plan, no matter what. No matter what type of challenge that may be set out against Him, God is prepared to take care of that. Good morning, good morning.
Good morning. We late. I thought it was 10:30.
You're all right. I'm long-winded, so you haven't missed a lot. So God, in this early story of God's people from Exodus, He has seen to it that they're carried out. Not only that, He's going to see, just as we see here in the Revelation later, that God carries the church away on figuratively on eagle's wings to protect and to guide the church and keep it safe, just as He did the Israelites as He brought them out of Egypt. So we have this character of God that is static. It's the same no matter what the situation is. And so we rely on that strength, and we can, because we can trust that when God says He's going to do something, He does it. This is what gives us hope, isn't it? You know, Hebrew letter describes hope as hoping of things that not seen. Well, we haven't seen heaven, but God has told us about it, so we can trust His Word, because we can look back through the entire history of God's work, and He's never failed to bring about His purpose. Whatever it was, He carried it out. to the letter as promised. The church in the wilderness. This is what we've encountered here in Revelation letter. Now I'm going to go back one more time in Exodus chapter 19. We're going to continue that story there for just a moment. I don't want to leave this reference out. Exodus chapter 19, and look at verse 4. Look at beginning in verse 3 of Exodus 19. And Moses went up unto God, and the Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, Thus shalt thou say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, You have seen what I did unto the Egyptians. All right. Remember the plagues that God brought about on the Egyptian. And all God was trying to do with Egypt was just saying, look, I'm serious. You let these people go. And Pharaoh's heart was hardened. In other words, his ego was such that you think you're big and bad, Jehovah? I'm going to show you how big and bad. I'm not going to let these people go. So God would send another plague. And some of the most terrible things of lice and flies and frogs and blood in the river and all these terrible things. And still Pharaoh, you talk about hard-headed. This guy but he was an egomaniac. He did not want to let these people go. And so God finally broke his spirit by taking the firstborn. And this finally broke Pharaoh's spirit for a little while. He didn't give up completely. But the point that we want to make here is, Yet ye have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, Exodus 19:4, and how I bare you on eagle's wings and brought you unto myself. There's that figure of God preserving his people. Now we find that echoing here in the 12th chapter of the Revelation letter. How God is preserving the church just like he preserved Old Testament Israel. We move on to verse 15 of Revelation 12. And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. Now, what comes out of Satan's mouth? Deception. He is a master liar. He misrepresents, he totally mischaracterizes, and just out flat lies. And the first introduction that we have to Satan in the Genesis account in the garden is he tells a lie. God has instructed Adam and Eve, you can have anything in the garden except this one fruit. And Satan comes along and says, why are you worried about that? You don't need to listen to God. What he told you about dying and suffering, that's not true. So the very first introduction we have to the person of Satan is he's a liar. And how does he use that lie? To bring down individual humans, just as he did Adam and Eve. And what happened to Adam and Eve when they disobeyed and ate of the forbidden fruit? They were put out of the garden where they had it made. They had it easy. And God punished them because they disobeyed. So here's the example of God giving a command, man disobeying, and woman disobeying. The woman disobeyed first. Don't forget that. Not going to let you off the hook. But both of them, in free will, disobeyed God's word. This also tells us God's no respecter of persons, man or woman. Whoever disobeys suffers the consequences. But also, we have on that other side of that coin, we have God's promise of preservation and the promise of heaven for those that are obedient, regardless of men, women, Jew, Greek, rich, poor. It doesn't make any difference. All are invited to be safe, to be preserved, and to live in eternity with God after this life, if we can maintain that faith and maintain that confidence in his word. I want to notice now what Satan's going to pour out of his mouth. He is after the church. He is trying to beat down the church, to stop the church, to do whatever he can. So he spews out these lies. And the force of these lies is going to become apparent in chapter 13, because his lie, as it's going to come about in the first century, is that you folks that are worshiping God are really off track. You need to be worshiping these idols. And this idea of emperor worship and the cult that it generated around the Roman empires who persecuted the church was that they had come up with a religion based on the emperor's worship, the worship of the emperor. That was the really true worship. And if you don't accept it, we're going to destroy you as individual Christians. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But this is what's coming out of Satan's mouth. And notice how strong this delusion is. And he cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. He didn't just spit. He doesn't just throw a mouthful. It's a flood that comes out of his mouth. This tells us that he can send a strong lie, and a bunch of it. Now, to illustrate this a little bit more about his deception, turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 11 for just a moment. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. We're going to look at verse 13. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ, and no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. Therefore it is no great thing that if his ministers also be transformed as the ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works. In other words, Satan has the power to influence individuals to say that they are God, that they are Christ. And you know, Christ warned us in Matthew chapter 24 and 25. He said, there's going to come a time where people are going to claim to be Christ. You got to be careful. There's going to be false teachers. All through the New Testament, we are warned about false teachers. Well, where are those false teachers coming from? They're coming out of the mouth of Satan, because he has deluded them to build themselves up into something they are not. Now turn to Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. And you hath he quickened who were dead in trespasses and sins. Now, in the Ephesian letter, Paul is talking to Gentiles, idolaters, who had been converted, had been taught the gospel, obeyed the gospel, and become Christians. So he's reminding them here that you were dead in sins, but God has made you alive through your obedience to the gospel, by your hearing, repenting, confessing, believing, and being baptized. You have now been made alive where you were dead to God. But because of your obedience and your acceptance of the truth that Jesus is the Son of God, he has made you alive. Look at verse 2 there of Ephesians 2. Where in time past ye walked according to the course of this world. Well, what's the course of this world? Well, John tells us in 1 John that the whole world lieth in wickedness. So the course of this world, and what is Satan's domain? It's the world. It's the earth. And we're going to look at that a little bit closer in Revelation chapter 13, as Satan he's incredibly angry because he was cast out of heaven for being in rebellion. And he's taking out his anger on mankind. Where in time past, Ephesians 2:2, ye walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air. There's Satan. The spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience. So this pictures Satan as having followers, as having children, so to speak. Remember when Jesus told the Pharisees, you're of your father the devil, and the truth is not in you? Well, that's exactly what is pictured here in Ephesians. But the encouraging part of this little passage in Ephesians is that these individuals who were once lost in sin, who were once within the power of the prince of the air, the prince of this world, they've come out of that. They've overcome it. So it's an example to us that no matter how bad we are, we can repent and come back to God. We can be thankful for that, can't we? That God has that much mercy. Like Wayman Swain always used to say, I'm sure God has as much mercy as He does justice, because I need that mercy. Now turn to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. We're going to begin in verse 7. For the mystery of iniquity doth already work, only he who now letteth will let until he be taken out of the way. And then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming, even him whose coming is after the working of Satan, with all power and signs and lying wonders, and with all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish, because they receive not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this cause God shall send them a strong delusion, that they shall believe a lie, that they might all be damned who believe not the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. You know, we might think that, well, God's playing a trick, He's sending a strong delusion. No. What God is doing, He is allowing individuals to make choices. He is allowing Satan to do his work because God is testing us. Now in one point this might seem kind of cruel. Well, wow, you send us into the world. I mean, we're here in the world, we've got all this stuff around us, but we're not defenseless and we're not hopeless. God has given us the power to overcome the world through the blood of Christ. And notice how here in the Thessalonian passage that we read, Satan is all about lying and wonders and deceivableness and influencing an individual to think they're okay. To think that they're okay. When Jesus comes back, their end will not be good. They will be lost. They will be condemned for that strong delusion that they have accepted in regard to the truth. Remember earlier in the Revelation letter where we talked about the bottomless pit being opened and the locust and the smoke came out and it kind of caused chaos and confusion and anxiety? That was Satan's lies coming straight out of hell. And we see this same thing portrayed once again now in the Revelation letter with the serpent spewing all this lie and deceivableness out of his mouth. Verse 16. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. And the dragon was wroth with the woman. All right. The earth helping the woman. God has designed nature to be a complement to the church in a way that we can appreciate God's creation. And as we look around, and as bad as the world and sin is, the world in itself is not evil. Material is not. You know, there was a group of believers back in the first century called themselves the aesthetics. And they thought that everything material, wood, flesh, everything was evil. Therefore, we don't need to, and they would starve themselves to death because they got so insanely worked up about this that they figured, well, if all the material world is bad, I better not eat that steak. I better not eat those potatoes because they're material things. We see how extreme we can get when we don't use reason. That's just like when we talk about money. The Bible doesn't say that money is the root of all evil. It says the love of money is the root of all evil. If the love of money is our prime motivator, we're going to miss some good stuff. We're going to miss some good stuff. Notice here in verse 17, And the dragon was wroth with the woman. All right, we've already seen that. He was ready to devour her offspring back here at the beginning of chapter 12. He was ready to put a stop to whatever this woman, this church, God's plan was going to bring. And he's mad because he hadn't stopped it. He's tried to persecute very early on, bring about the downfall of man there in the garden. Once again, he influenced Pharaoh to mistreat and oppress God's people. And we see all through the Old Testament the evidence of evil and brutality and cruelty and lying. All of those things Satan is responsible for those things. Now, you know, like Flip Wilson, a comedian that lived years ago, he had this comedy routine, and when he'd do something bad, he said, well, the devil made me do it. Well, the devil doesn't make us do anything. Now, he may put something out there just like that fruit in the garden. It looks good. I know fruit tastes good, and if I eat it, I will gain something. Satan puts that kind of forbidden fruit out there in a lot of different ways, whether it's money, whether it's physical indulgence, whatever it might be, to try to get us off track. And he's wroth with the woman, but notice what it follows up with here in verse 17. And went to make war with the remnant of her seed. Who is that? That's the church. That's you. Satan is mad because he's been kicked out of heaven. He's mad because he hasn't been able to overcome. He hasn't stopped Jesus. He hasn't stopped the church. But boy, he's going to keep trying. He's going to keep after the remnant of her seed. And how are they described? How do we know that this is the church, that this is Christians that we're talking about here? Because he goes on to describe the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So who is that? That's the church. That's Christians. So Satan, in his everlasting anger, in his everlasting fury of rebellion, continues to hate the church and everything good. Now, we've established here up through chapter 12 now, we've got Satan in direct confrontation, not with just God and Jesus, but God's people, the church, and he's continuing in his anger to do this. Now we're going to really get deep into this Satan using lies, using his influence to bring about bad in chapter 13. Because we're going to find, and this is a strange situation that for us, it's a little bit strange anyway. As the empire of Rome grew, both in land mass and in power over the peoples and countries that bordered Rome, whoever was in control, the emperor, they began to think that they were really special. And most of them were egomaniacs. Some of them were just maniacs. But they certainly felt that they were special. And some of them even got the idea, well, you know what? I'm so special, I'm a god. They believed in the pagan gods of Rome and the Greeks, and even going all the way back into Babylonian culture. But as they built themselves up, and we can look back at the kings of the Old Testament, some of them thought that they were God. If you remember back the account of Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel, he thought he was so special, he had a golden statue built in his image, and he demanded everybody bow down and worship it. So as we enter into the time of the Roman Empire, we have emperors who set themselves up as deity. In other words, they feel like they are equal to God in heaven. And therefore, they have that great power. Now, where would they get the idea that they're as great as God? Satan. He is influencing these individuals. So, what if you're this megalomaniac, ungodly thinking you're a God emperor. And over here is a group of people that say, we will not worship you. We know who God is. We know what God does. We have a history recorded of the power of the God of heaven. And Mr. Emperor of Rome, you ain't it. So we refuse to bow down to you and your cult of worship and consider you as deity. Well, as you might imagine, these emperors, and not all emperors of Rome were anti-Christian. Not all of them were. We got to make that point, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But they thought, well, if these people, I demand that you worship me. No, I'm not going to. All right. I'm going to preface this, and we'll get into this deeper next week. Persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire began almost immediately in the early days of the church. And from time to time it would ebb and flow, but one of the worst periods of persecution of Christianity by the Roman Empire was by an emperor called Diocletian. And I'm going to read you something that I picked up this morning to give us a little background. The Diocletian persecution of Christians in Rome was the final and deadliest persecution of early Christians during the Roman Empire. The persecution began in 303 by order of the Emperor Diocletian and continued for 8 years under his successors. Diocletian's edict, which was a command that he put out throughout the empire, ordered Christian churches to be destroyed. Sacred writings, this means anybody that had a copy of the New Testament, Old Testament, whatever it might have been, that they'd be gathered up and burned. The goods and status stripped from those who would not renounce their religion. In other words, your property was confiscated. Your home would be taken and sold off. So you're without a home. Christians who continued to profess their faith were arrested, tortured, and executed. And although the order was an attempt to eradicate Christianity, the religion continued to grow despite the persecution. And the order was lifted in 311 by an edict of toleration issued by Emperor Galerius, and 2 years later, Christians across the empire were granted religious freedom. Now think about that. You refuse to acknowledge the emperor as deity. And so you might think, well, that's the end of that. Oh no.